With House of Ashes just days away, I think this is the perfect time to make some final predictions about the plot, based on all of the evidence we've seen in the trailers, the Kalis website, demos, and the various interviews Supermassive Games have done. I don't know anything official, so while there are technically no spoilers here, if any of this is right, it could ruin a bunch of surprises. So what I'll be laying out is simply my predictions, and then I'll mention the evidence that suggested them, at least when I'm not making wild guesses, which I will definitely be doing as well. We have good reasons to believe that the prologue is set in Akkad, thousands of years ago, possibly during the consecration of a temple. The backstory seems to be that during a military campaign, Naram Sin's armies sacked a temple, and after their kingdom suffered a drought, he built a new temple, likely to appease the gods, possibly on a sacred site, but we'll come back to that later. The prologue will feature the player, as Balathu, murdering someone with a spear, possibly as part of a sacrificial ritual. At the end of the prologue, we'll likely see the cataclysm that sinks the temple, although right now we're not sure whether that causes just an earthquake, the supernatural rage of the gods, or perhaps something stranger. Over the next 2,000 years, the bad creatures and the vampire come out of the pit from time to time, in order to feed on livestock and occasionally people. And gradually a cult is formed around it, with members that sacrifice travelers to the monsters in order to keep them from killing locals or eating their livestock. Then we have the archaeological expedition, which starts off as an attempt to find the tomb of Alexander the Great in 1946. Now this could be a simple translation error. Legends could remember the temple as the burial site of some kind of god king, which could easily be misconstrued as a reference to Alexander the Great. Given the H.P. Lovecraft inspiration and the speech that Randolph gives, it's pretty safe to assume that deep under the temple the expedition discovers something far more horrifying than bat monsters. Something that, like all the best Lovecraft heroes, shakes the character's faith in the natural order of the universe. After all, while the bat monsters are clearly terrifying, the autopsy note reveals that the expedition thought of them primarily as some kind of undiscovered animal. After all, they were able to kill one and perform an autopsy on it without too much trouble. Even a swarm of the monsters wouldn't drive a man to talk about finding things that humans weren't meant to know. So there must be something more bizarre underneath the temple. After finding whatever's in the bottom of the caves, Randolph tries to destroy the entrance by collapsing the temple. But someone, possibly a cult member who had infiltrated the expedition, sabotages the detonator to keep them from sealing the creatures away. Despite this, the entrance to the cave winds up covered somehow, and so no one ever finds out exactly what happened to the expedition. As for the members of the expedition, presumably they're eaten by monsters, and likely some of them are transformed into bat monsters as well. Then the plot moves forward to May 2003. We've been told that all of this is set at the end of the Iraq War, which is generally thought of as the famous Mission Accomplished speech that Bush gave on May 1st, 2003. If the game is set on the night of May 30th and the morning of May 31st, that means the US government was facing extreme pressure to produce the weapons of mass destruction that the war was supposedly started to secure. We won't go into how that was all a bunch of lies and explaining the project for a new American century, because all that matters is that plenty of people in the military believed the lies that they were told about WMDs, and were desperate enough to go to extreme risks to find them. One risk is likely them relying on the Kalis project, which may be related to ground-penetrating satellite imaging. Eric King, who's running the project, finds the caves and assumes they're a chemical weapons lab and storage facility, then rushes together an ill-advised Special Forces raid, hoping to take the Iraqis by surprise, since a larger military mobilization might give the Iraqis enough time to destroy or move the facility. Somehow the members of the Iraqi Republican Guard find out about the planned raid, and even though the major combat operations are over, they decide to ambush the Special Forces operatives as an act of resistance. Notably, the Iraqi army was no longer a functional operating entity at this point, and had been officially disbanded a week earlier on the 23rd. If the game is, in fact, set on the 30th going into the 31st, then the Iraqis are actually resistance fighters, and not an army unit per se. During the attack, the crashing helicopter damages the already unstable ground above the buried temple, sending the soldiers down inside, where they're soon attacked by the newly awakened bat monsters. Now we get to the stuff we've already seen in the demo and trailers, with Eric, Jason, and Nick teaming up while Rachel ends up falling into the blood pit and Salim is off on his own. From here we get the exploration we've seen pieces of. My general prediction is that while the guys are finding information about the archaeological expedition, Rachel will get deeper into the monster's hive and find out something terrible, possibly where the captured Americans like Joey and Clarice are being held, maybe partway transformed into bat monsters. The men will meet Salim, hopefully team up, and use either their own explosives or the dynamite from the temple to set up a bunch of traps to defend themselves from the monsters. It's likely that all of the surviving characters will reunite at some point and defend the temple before getting split up by a monster attack and having separate adventures. Possibly Rachel brings back word about the people cocooned in the pit and they attempt some sort of rescue mission. Down in the pit, they'll find out what's really been going on, hopefully rescue some people, and then head back up to the surface just as dawn is breaking. For a moment it will look like they're safe, but then, since the game is set on May 31st, 2003, an eclipse happens right at sunrise, and the monsters are free to spend the next 5 minutes racing around the surface, trying to kill the remaining characters. This will likely be the final dramatic climax of the game, like the Wendigos in the chalet in Until Dawn, or the fight with Olsen in Medan, and the fight outside the burned house in Little Hope. This is exactly the kind of ending Supermassive loves, and it's poised to be the best one yet, since players will have a moment of thinking they've made it into the safe sunlight, only for the fight to start all over again. Either the heroes get killed and the monsters retreat with their bodies, or they kill the monsters and have the monsters' bodies burn away in the sunlight. Of course, in real life, Iraq only had a partial eclipse on May 31st, 2003, so bat monsters that couldn't even take moonlight probably wouldn't be able to function at all. That's something they can obviously cheat, of course. No one's going to complain about a lack of realism when it comes to how dark it gets during an eclipse. I mean, I will. Obviously, I just did. But there's something wrong with me, so yeah. That's how I'm guessing the plot will play out, although obviously all of the specific details, like how things will change if you keep the NPCs alive versus getting them killed, are still largely a mystery. Now, for the prediction about what's going on, specifically the monster's origin. I believe that the bat monsters are humans transformed by some kind of blood-drinking parasite, possibly transmitted by being bitten by the bat monsters or the vampire. In fact, the vampire could be some kind of alpha monster, the first one to be converted by the parasites, and under that theory, the bat monsters would be created when he infected people with the parasites. And since they come from him instead of their original host, maybe they're mutated more severely somehow. Basically, I'm describing how vampires work in Don't Nod's game, Vampire. I have 4 pieces of evidence for parasite infection-based human transformation, which are the warped skull, the similarity of the creature to those in the movie The Cave, the scene where Clarice needs some kind of medication rather than medical attention, and the 2 scenes in which Rachel is killed by another human character. Here she's shot in the head by someone, and while you can't see her in this next scene, in the AMA, someone said that the death that was the most troubling involved Nick, Rachel, and a big rock. While that might not be the biggest rock, Nick having to kill his lover because she was turning into a monster would be a hell of a traumatic thing to watch. Also, Until Dawn did a fake version of the "you have to kill a loved one before they turned into a monster" scene when Mike has a gun on Emily. And if there's parasites, infections, and turning into bat monsters, this would be a chance for Supermassive to do that scene again, but for real this time. Now, let's get into what's going on. Where are the monsters from? There are 3 obvious options. 1. They're a strange but natural undiscovered creature that lives in the caves under the Zagros Mountains. This isn't likely because that's the exact plot of The Cave, and I don't see them doing that obvious a reference. Likelihood of this is about 10%. 2. They're magical creatures created by gods as part of a curse on Naram's sin and the kingdom of Akkad. Actual magical vampires transformed from men into beasts, inspiring the legends. Likelihood of this is about 30%. The third option is they're aliens from space. At some point in the past, some kind of an alien ship, or just a meteor with life on it, I suppose, crashed in the Zagros Mountains. Either this became something of a holy site, because it fell from heaven, and that's why the temple was built there, or maybe the crash happens during the prologue, and that's what buries the temple. I put the likelihood of this happening at about 60%. So, why am I so sure that it's aliens? I have 4 incredibly thin pieces of evidence. First, a major inspiration for this story is said to be At the Mountains of Madness, H.P. Lovecraft's tale of an ill-fated expedition to a mysterious city in the Antarctic. A team of researchers disappear, and when a second group goes to find out what happened, they discover that the researchers have been slaughtered by a terrifying and unknowable threat. If this sounds familiar, it's because the story structure became a popular one. Movies such as Aliens, The Thing, and Prometheus are all loose adaptations of At the Mountains of Madness. Second, take a look at the statement of Randolph Not Carter. He talks about the sleeping horrors underneath their feet. And yes, that could just be a strange underground world, but the way he talks about the threat, the indescribable shapes and forms, seems like something bigger and stranger than a vampire and some bat monsters. He's getting closer to talking about full-on Shoggoths or other Lovecraftian beasts. There's something weird down in the pit, and to my mind, that means aliens crashed, or perhaps, going full Lovecraft, they arrived millions of years earlier. And there's actually an alien city down there. Third, in this scene, Salim and Jason are next to a hole in the ground that's full of green light. Maybe it's just me, but as a general rule, eerie green light suggests aliens. Fourth and finally, we've got a really meta point, because it's about how Supermassive structures their games. In all of their horror interactive movies so far, players can make it all the way through the story without finding out what's really going on. In Medan, you can get all the way through the game believing that you're on a haunted ghost ship. In Until Dawn, players can get through the first half of the game without discovering that Josh is the psycho, and you can get to the end of the game without ever finding out that the main Wendigo is Hannah. In The Inpatient, the player can get all the way to the end without ever finding out why they were in the hospital in the first place. In Little Hope, you can get to the ending without finding out that the fire was an accident, and that Megan's ghost arranged the whole experience so that Anthony could get over his rage and let her move on. So, with that in mind, what's the big secret that players can get through the game without discovering? It's not the bat monsters, which can't be missed. It's not the vampire, who's probably Balathu from the prologue and will likely be a second or third act threat. So what could there be far under the temple that would A, drive Randolph near to madness, and B, amaze the player with a huge revelation they didn't see coming? Aliens fits both of these bills better than any other option. It would obviously mess with Randolph's mind, and it creates the exact kind of dual-track discovery that the other games have. A large number of players could go through the game thinking that these are magical vampires from ancient history, and the people who went to the trouble of finding all of the secrets will discover that it's really a byproduct of an alien life form trying to survive on Earth. So, that's my prediction about the game's story, and the evidence I have to back it up. Yes, it's thin, and yes, it's a stretch. And yes, there's a good chance I'll look like a bit of a fool once the game is available. But I wanted to get it all out there before we play the game, and the truth is revealed. I've been the Hidden Object Guru, thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please remember to like and subscribe. Thanks to my patrons, Marissa, Desire, Eduardo, Joanne, and Brian. If you'd like to support the channel so I can continue making videos like this one, check out the Patreon link. Special thanks to Ferret, who was kind enough to help me with this video. If there's any topics you'd like to see covered, be sure to mention them in the comments section below the video. See you back here for more Dark Pictures, but until then, au revoir.